What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the show. This is Faraz Siddiqui, Upper Hand Fantasy Podcast. Wide receivers, tight ends, going into Week 13. Let's get it popping. Great way to get it popping. First thing in my notes here, Bailey Zappi getting the start for the Patriots, right? That's how you get things popping, by talking about the Patriots. But I think, what impact does that make? Listen, whether it's Mac Jones or Zappi, the offense is going to be bad. But Demario Douglas, still the number one wide receiver. Now, he told reporters that he didn't have a concussion coming out of the game, but he is in the protocol. He didn't practice on Wednesday, so something to monitor there. Okay, we'll see if he's clearing later in the week. If he's out, we'll probably see more targets from Ramondre. But, Demario Douglas is their number one wide receiver if he does end up playing. He had 3 catches after Zappi came into the game. So no extra worry there, outside this offense being bad. 2 of Zappi's targets went to Ramondre. So, things will be okay. Cooper Kupp got a full practice in on Wednesday. What does that tell me? It tells me that he's startable. Okay, I know he's hard to trust. I know it's a very, very tough matchup against the Browns. I just don't want to look too deep into the barrel to find a replacement. Okay, I understand your playoff hopes are on the line, but I just rather put my playoff hopes on Cooper Kupp than I am on a lot of these, other wide receivers that you might be, digging too deep for, right? Now, if you have a solid wide receiver, who's been relatively getting it done and you trust them more, sure, this is all a trust thing, right? And if you don't trust Cooper Kupp, I get it. This is your lineup. You do what you want. Now, I did move him down. I have him at wide receiver at 19. I have Puka at wide receiver at 18. So, guys, I'm starting over them. Tank Dell, Nico Collins, who, by the way, have some tough matchups this week themselves against Denver. Okay, but also Devontae Smith, Deebo Samuel, right? Calvin Ridley, Adam Thielen, maybe, Christian Kirk. Those are guys that I'm considering over Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, okay? So, totally understand if you want to bench both these guys or at least bench Kupp, do your thing. But it all comes down to trust. And if you don't have the trust, don't put them in your lineup, right? But for me personally, I know that things can change fast. The game plan last week was based on the run game, right, against Arizona. Jordan Rodriguez, who's a beat reporter for the Rams, the fact that the tight ends were so involved in that game, it had to do with disguising the run game. On that second touchdown to Higbee, Puka was also an option on that slant. The first touchdown, those wide receivers weren't even on the field. It was a run play. It was a run look, right? But yeah, no. So I do trust Puka a little bit more than Kupp. His matchup on the right side is a little bit better, but there's no doubt that this is a very tough situation, very tough decision to make. I think I'm okay with him in my lineup this week against the Browns. You can check our flex rankings at upperhandfantasy.com to see which running backs I'm playing over these guys. There are definitely a good number of running backs, maybe 18 or so running backs I'm playing over both of these Rams wide receivers. Josh Palmer is eligible to return this week, but Chargers head coach Brandon Staley said that, there is a chance that Palmer is back this season. So to me that means that Palmer is probably not coming back this week or next week. So still going to monitor, to see when they activate him. But don't expect to have him soon. I think he's still worth a stash in your IR spot. Keep an eye on Trey McBride. He didn't practice on Wednesday with a groin injury. Monitor his practice reports throughout the week. Kenneth Walker isn't playing on Thursday night. Okay, Zach Charbonnet is a borderline RB2 for me. Tough matchup. We know he'll get the volume. So, I don't trust this Seahawks offense in general. So I don't trust Charbonnet a whole lot, but we know that, he'll get some targets. He'll get some run, in the run game, obviously, but, don't trust him a whole lot. Not a whole lot of upside, I think, for Charbonnet this week. Chris Olave is in the concussion protocol. He did get a limited practice in on Wednesday, which is a pretty good sign. That's the best case scenario for a player in the concussion protocol. I think Olave has a chance of playing this week. If he does go, he has a great matchup against Detroit, and I would consider him a must-start in that game. Limited practice for Achane to start the week. I have him as a solid RB2 if he plays, but obviously proceeding with caution here. If he had a full practice today, that would really, pique my interest even more. So maybe some full practices the rest of this week would definitely increase my confidence in him. Raheem Mostert didn't practice, but, this is something that he's been dealing with. He hasn't practiced on Wednesdays. I don't think he's dealing with anything new because it's the same, ankle, knee thing that they've been listing him at for the last couple of weeks. He's a borderline RB1 play for me this week. We might end up seeing Joe Flacco start for the Browns this week. He was named the backup, and then Dorian Thompson-Robinson, he's in the concussion protocol after that hit that he took. He didn't practice on Wednesday, so what does that mean? Who knows? With Joe Flacco starting, but I think Amari Cooper could get a boost here, right? Because we have someone who can pass the ball downfield if they need to. Garrett Wilson had a 27% target share from Flacco last year, 300 yards and 2 touchdowns in 4 games. Not bad. Okay, so by the way, Amari didn't practice on Wednesday. He never practices on Wednesdays, though. He was listed as a DNP, but non-injury related. So looks like those ribs are okay, and he'll play this week. Jerick McKinnon didn't practice on Wednesday. Not a great sign for his availability this week. So Isaiah Pacheco would benefit a ton if McKinnon is out. We talked about it a lot on yesterday's running back show. If you haven't listened to that episode, make sure to tune in. We go over, with Zach, I go over quarterbacks and running backs. So make sure you check that out. Cardinals wide receiver Michael Wilson still not practicing due to that shoulder injury. That means that Greg Dortch is in play once again. 25% target share, 20% target share the last 2 weeks with Kyler Murray. That makes him, definitely startable as a flex play if you need him. Noah Brown practiced in a limited fashion this week. He could be back on Wednesday. He practiced in a limited fashion, I should say. He's a flex play at best, not the best matchup in the world, but he is attached to CJ Stroud. Also, keep an eye on Dalton Schultz, who didn't practice because of a hamstring injury. Just monitor his practice reports on Thursday and Friday. We should note that Tank Dell also didn't practice due to a calf injury. Is that serious? Who knows? His head coach did say he thinks that he should be okay. They'll monitor it throughout the week, but just keep that in mind. Okay. If you've been depending on Josh Dobbs as your quarterback, you might want to pick up another quarterback for Week 14. Okay, just in case. And by the way, that's next week, not this week, because the Vikings are on bye. But Kevin O'Connell did say that there could be a change at the quarterback position after the bye. So you might want to pick up someone like maybe Russell Wilson if he's available to hold it down for you the rest of the way. All right? Just a little heads up. All right, before we move to wide receivers, I have a small request for you. Most of you who listen are not subscribed to the show, to the podcast. If you could just take a few seconds to do that now, it helps us out so much. It helps keep us consistent. It helps improve the show. It helps more people find out about the show. That in turn helps us improve the show. More shows can be added. More types of shows can be added. We have a lot of plans for this podcast, and it's going to get bigger and better. Those are our plans. We need your help, though. Okay, so hitting the follow button, hitting the add button on your podcast app means a ton. Whether it's Apple Podcast, Spotify, whatever it is. And then if you're watching on YouTube, hitting subscribe on YouTube means everything as well. So we really appreciate you guys, as always. I got a whole lot of messages, DMs from you guys yesterday, with Upper Hand being one of your top podcasts on Spotify that you listen to this year. It means so much to me, honestly. Like, I see my name next to, these podcasts that I listen to, obviously much more popular guys, much more popular podcasts. So the fact that you guys are taking out the time to listen to the show means a whole lot. Okay, so keep those messages coming because I'm doing a merch giveaway. I'm giving away a bunch of merch to people who DM me and people who tag me on their stories. With that Spotify. If Upper Hand was one of the most listened to podcasts for you, post it. I'll repost it on my story. Send you some merch. All right, moving on to wide receivers. You're obviously starting Tyreek Hill, but I just need to point out the matchup that he has this week and how amazing it is, right? Just gives us something to look forward to this weekend. Similar thing with Jaylen Waddle. Have to have him in my lineup this week. These two play primarily on the perimeter. The Commanders have given up the most fantasy points to perimeter wide receivers this year. They've also given up the most receiving yards to wide receivers overall, the most touchdowns to wide receivers overall this year. So looking forward to that for sure. We have to highlight the 49ers wide receivers as well. Just a great matchup here. The only team that has given up more fantasy points to wide receivers than the Commanders are the Eagles. So Brandon Ayuk must start for me. He's in my top 10. Deebo Samuel's my wide receiver 13 on the week. Can't really have these guys on the bench, right? I know Deebo's on the cusp, because he's up and down, you don't know whether to start him or not, but this is the type of matchup you don't really want to miss out on because of the upside. Now, it probably won't be all of them, producing, right, at their highest levels. You have only one football, you have 4 players, right? You have, obviously, CMC, Ayuk, Deebo, and Kittle, but you got to take that shot on all of them, right? Kittle also has a great matchup as well. This game in general is just likely to be a competitive one 47.5 game total. 49ers favored by 3, despite them being on the road. Just target players in this game. The only guy in this game who gets a downgrade because of a tough matchup is DeAndre Swift. Outside of that, just start everyone. And even Swift is startable, but he is more of a lower-end RB2 for me this week. There are a lot of good matchup with these alpha wide receivers, like in the top 10, but it really gets a little bit gross for certain guys after these top guys in terms of matchups. Pretty interesting week. It seems very top-heavy in terms of good matchups. But Michael Pittman, right, like he falls into that category because he has an amazing matchup this week. He's my wide receiver 6 on the week. Tennessee's given up the 7th most fantasy points to perimeter wide receivers over the last 4 weeks, the 5th most over the course of the season. Josh Downs' matchup out of the slot is not amazing. He has overcome some tough matchups this year, but this is the same Titans defense that shut down Adam Thielen out of the slot. Now, this is definitely a different situation because the Titans' main concern will be Michael Pittman. So I don't think they can apply the same resources that they applied to Adam Thielen to Josh Downs, right? That bracket coverage probably won't be there for Josh Downs, so that's good. But at the same time, the Titans have allowed the second fewest fantasy points to slot wide receivers over the last 4 games. It's really the perimeter where teams have gotten their production against the Titans, okay? So Downs is my wide receiver 29 on the week, solid wide receiver 3. That could be a little low. He could be anywhere from like wide receiver 25 on. He had a great target share last week, 32%. It was a pretty good matchup, though, out of the slot. He didn't come through big time, but he saw the targets, but he didn't really come through in that good matchup. If he gets something similar this week in terms of target share, he's probably going to produce, regardless of the tough matchup, right? Because the targets, that trumps matchup every single day of the week. Now, also, it's like you consider this matchup. It's like, are the Colts going to have to throw the ball a whole lot in this matchup? I don't know. We'll see. I have moved Calvin really up in my rankings to a high-end wide receiver 2 this week. Now I'm nervous, right? Because I moved him up way too high, right? Just when we're starting to trust you, Calvin, don't let us down, okay? But Cincinnati, they're not great on the perimeter. They've allowed the 11th most fantasy points to perimeter wide receivers over the last 8 weeks, the 12th most over the last 4 weeks. So this is a decent matchup. Now, the Jaguars will have to throw it a ton, right? Maybe not in this game, right? So I doubt they throw it a ton. So I'm tempering expectations, because of that. At the same time, though, really has been getting it done lately. It's a good matchup. They're going to have to score some points. There's a solid chance he continues his streak because of the matchup, okay? Now, Christian Kirk also has a great matchup out of the slot as well, just like he did last week, and he, came through for the most part. But the Bengals, have been even worse at covering the slot than they do covering the perimeter. 3rd most fantasy points given up to slot wide receivers over the last 4 weeks, the 5th most over the course of the season. Now, are we trusting Adam Thielen, right? That's the question. A lot of trust issues this week for a few wide receivers. He's finished in the top 24 only twice in the last 5 weeks. Not great. I can see where the trust issues are coming from. Okay. But, in the last 3 weeks, he had 2 games where he had 10 targets and 11 targets against Chicago and Dallas, right? And this week, he has a good matchup against the Bucs defense, giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to slot wide receivers over the last 8 weeks. So I can see this being a pretty good game for Thielen, right? They're shaking things up in Carolina. I think they keep things relatively simple for Bryce Young this week against a beatable secondary. I think Thielen's going to get his targets this week. A lot of questions around Jamar Chase. I have him as a back-end wide receiver 2 this week. The Jaguars have given up the 3rd most fantasy points to perimeter wide receivers over the last 8 weeks. Both Nico and Tank Dell did their thing last week against this team. I think Chase can have a solid game. My only concern is that, he didn't have that, ridiculously high target share last week. He had 25%, which is extremely solid, okay? Don't get me wrong. But in order for him to, overcome this, bad offensive situation, I think he's going to need more than that. Now, he's not going straight to my bench. I'm just tempering expectations. I hope that he has a solid floor in this one. By the way, you can catch my rankings over at upperhandfantasy.com. Full positional and flex rankings updated daily all the way up until Sunday. Jerry Judy's a flex play for me this week, only because he has a good matchup against Houston's nickel defense. They've given up the 3rd most fantasy points to slot wide receivers this year, the 2nd most over the last 4 and 8 weeks. This is one of the games to target in terms of getting your fantasy players in it. 47.5 total, according to FantasyLife.com's Game Hub, and the Texans are favored by only 3.5 points. So this could be a competitive game here. If you're looking for a deep play this week, like a 14-team league, or if you're just desperate, you got wide receivers on bye, you need someone off the waiver wire, I think you can pick up Jaylen Guyton and start him. Okay, the Patriots have allowed a ton of big plays this year. They've also allowed the third most fantasy points to wide receivers over the last 4 weeks, the sixth most over the last 8 weeks. He was banged up recently. He had a tough matchup against Baltimore last week. But I think this week, he's an upside deep play if you're desperate, because all Justin Herbert has right now is Keenan Allen, in the pass game, specifically down the field. Okay. Demario Douglas is a good matchup as well. Talked about him earlier. The Chargers have given up the sixth most fantasy points to wide receivers out of the slot this year. He's a solid PPR flex play. I actually have him as a low-end wide receiver 3 this week, assuming he plays. Okay, keep that in mind. By the way, I really like Diontae Johnson this week. I guess I like him every week, though. But he had that touchdown last week that should have been ruled a touchdown. It should have been challenged by Mike Tomlin. And now I'm just sounding butthurt. Okay, but whatever. He has a great matchup on that right side where he runs most of his routes from. The Cardinals have given up the second most fantasy points to that right side over the last 8 weeks and over the last 4 weeks. So I think he's set up nicely in this one. In a game after the Steelers just put up 400 yards of offense, as soon as they fire the offensive coordinator, what a coincidence. We'll see if they can build some offensive momentum after this game. So I have Diontae as a solid wide receiver 2 this week. Mike Evans has a tough matchup this week, but it's really tough to move him outside my top 10. Like, he's just that good, right? Carolina has played wide receivers tough, though. Third fewest fantasy points to wide receivers over the last 4 weeks. The fifth fewest fantasy points to perimeter wide receivers over the last 8 weeks. So something to keep in mind, okay? Most likely you're starting Evans either way. I'm probably benching Chris Godwin this week. He hasn't got it done, and the matchup out of the slot is absolutely terrible for him. Some more tough matchups. Obviously, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett against Dallas. They're going to have to throw the ball, though, right? So I think these guys will be okay. Still tempering expectations. Also tempering expectations for Garrett Wilson this week against Atlanta. They've given up the fifth least fantasy points to wide receivers this year and over the last 4 weeks as well, especially on the perimeter. Temper expectations for Packers wide receivers against Kansas City. Christian Watson probably is the toughest matchup out of all these wide receivers. If I'm starting any of them, it's probably Jaden Reed. I will also probably be avoiding Drake London this week against the Jets' perimeter defense. And Tank Dell and Nico Collins, man, I think I'm tempering expectations for them as well. Denver's given up the second least fantasy points to perimeter wide receivers over the last 8 weeks. They've given up the second fewest fantasy points to wide receivers in general over the last 4 weeks and over the last 8 weeks. So I'm still starting them, but have to temper expectations. Okay, I don't think Patrick Surtain is going to shadow either of these guys since they don't have a clear guy there, assuming both Nico Collins and Tank Dell play, because Tank, didn't practice on Wednesday. But I think it's very possible we see Dalton Schultz have a good game in this one. Now, Dalton Schultz also didn't practice with a hamstring injury on Wednesday. Hopefully he's been fine. His route participation dropped last week, and I'm wondering if that has anything to do with the hamstring injury. But, given how good Denver has been against wide receivers and how bad they've been against tight ends, this could be a funnel game for Dalton Schultz, assuming that he's healthy. Okay, so monitor these injuries for the Texans, Tank Dell and Dalton Schultz. But if they do end up playing, this is kind of how I see it playing out. Not a whole lot to talk about with tight ends overall, but we can get on them real quick. Kittle's a must start in this matchup against Philly. I have him, Laporta, Trey McBride, and Dalton Schultz making the top 5 this week. If you're looking for a streamer, definitely consider Taysom Hill, especially given all the injuries that New Orleans has in the pass catching department. But last week he had 7 carries and 2 targets. They need help at the receiver position, okay? So he'll get an upgrade if Chris Olave doesn't play, but either way, I think Hill should be considered as a boom-bust tight end option, with the boom being an overall tight end 1 finish potentially, right? On the same team, you have Juwan Johnson, 85% route participation, 19% target share last week, very solid. They need receivers. There's some rapport there with Derek Carr. I think Juwan Johnson is the easy stream of the week for me. If you want more safety, I would say go Juwan. If you want more upside, go Taysom Hill. Evan Engram has a great matchup against Cincinnati. I think he's a solid play. He finally, he's really looking for that first touchdown. Maybe he'll get it this week. But David Njoku has been peppered in the receiving game. Make sure you're starting him if you have him. Jake Ferguson, Pat Freiermuth are next up after those guys. We'll see if Freiermuth can build off of this huge game that he just had. It was a 1-game sample. Don't want to get too ahead of myself here. But he'll be moving from the tight end 9, which I have him at right now, to potentially top 6 if he can continue doing what he's doing. Okay, that's going to do it for this episode, guys. Appreciate appreciate you so much. Okay, check out the rankings at upperhandfantasy.com if you need them. And we'll be back. Zach's going to be back tomorrow for an update, going over the injury report, going over any news that we need to cover going into the weekend. All right. It's possible that I'll miss some lives on Sunday. I'm trying my best to be there. I'm going on a little family vacation with the kids, in-laws, all that. All right. So should be a good time. I'm going to try to, not do work, but knowing me, I probably will do some stuff, and I'll probably be catching the games on Sunday too, because that's what I love and what I do. So it is what it is. So appreciate you guys. I'll be back. I'll see you guys soon. Take it easy. Bye-bye.